5.3 political parties. Let's get going. As you know, my name is Ms. Hitchcock. You can call me Ms. Hitch. I am from Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology out of Alexandria, Virginia. Today, we are going to be taking a look at analyzing election data so that we can explain how parties are organized to facilitate the communication of policy preferences to policymakers. And you'll know you got it when you can successfully attempt a full quantitative FRQ. Woohoo! A little bit of thing to do for you over the weekend. All right. Today's prereqs, we're going to be touching up on something that you may or may not have had an opportunity to kind of fully extend yourself through, but it's some working knowledge, I hope. So 4.1, American attitude towards government and politics, and then 4.7, ideologies of political parties. We're going to be looking at data analysis and trying to figure out what is a linkage institution and what do political parties do. So let's get started. Just, touch and base on our daily thing. We're here through May 1. We got a course coverage. Calendar will come out later next week. Doesn't match what you've heard out of College Board thus far because this is a prereq for additional courses you might take in college related to poli-sci, and we want to make sure you get that college credit. And as always, please check out those resources in the description. If you can't access it, it has to do with the email account that you're reaching out to Google from. So change your Google, change your password, change your email, figure out what it takes. And in there, you'll find copies of this PowerPoint as well as the previous 2 days. Yeah. All right. So again, why is it like this? Why is there so many words? Why do I have to read? Because sometimes I want to anticipate the needs of people and preferences of all viewers. And some people just don't want to listen to this. That's fine. You don't want to listen to this. I'm not going to take offense to it. So the slides are text and visual aid heavy to help out those folks who just don't want any of this. All right. So I want to start off right off the top of the bat and say, I want you to remember, this is live, right? So I'm going to make mistakes, and I made 2 yesterday. As we go through this, I would love for you to shout out to me and catch my mistakes so that we can kind of laugh a little bit about it, because I'm going to make mistakes, number one. And number 2, it really does a nice job driving home the point that we all make what's known in the AP reader world as minor factual errors. When we're being asked to recall information very quickly, sometimes we might get people's names. So yesterday when I forgot Barbara Rose Johns' last name, that's just because I couldn't pull it. I couldn't get it out of my mouth. I couldn't say Robert R. Moulton High School in Farmville, Virginia. So I will catch myself on Twitter, but I am challenging you to beat me to it. My second minor factual error for the day was, hey, that case I talked about, Shelby County v. Holder, was actually 2013, not 2015. So don't tell my committee chair at Virginia Tech. I spent 3 years studying that court case, and I couldn't even get the date right. Good job. Okay, so interactivity, I like it. I've got 2 questions that I want to share with you. First of all, Caden, and if you guys can tell me the high school that you're from and the state that you live in, and a shout out to your AP teacher, that would be awesome too. So Caden asked me this question. Many have described the coronavirus outbreak as a war against an invisible enemy. Others have called it a national emergency. Yesterday, I talked about trust in government and how wars and emergencies affect those things over the long term. And so Caden wants to know how does COVID seem to lean? And so my answer off the top of my head, I did think about it a little bit, is that trust decreases the longer those prolonged conflicts go on. And so when they're unresolved and they become more controversial and we're sending more troops overseas, we tend to see that trust in government will decrease the longer they go on. The other issue here is that national emergencies, including wars, including like right when the outbreak of war is there because national sovereignty is at risk, that's when we generally see people rally around the flag and we see trust in government go up because there's that external threat. So my prediction, Caden, for you is that in the short term, should this be dealt with quick, decisive action, we should see a boost in trust in government. If it goes on for an extended period of time with limited effectiveness, I think that it'll start to have a negative impact on trust in government. And not that this is the same metric, but this is measuring presidential popularity on 538. There's a link up there at the top. So you see that there has been a little bit of jump in the presidential approval ratings down there on the bottom side in green for President Trump. And we would say that that is associated with the coronavirus issue. So there are people who are changing their mind about how President Trump is performing in office in the last month. My second question from Robbie is, what is the difference between VEEP and VAP? That's a great question. All right, so here, without getting too bogged down in the details, and I did send this to Robbie yesterday on Twitter, was that this is kind of beyond, I think, anything that College Board would ever ask you to know. This would be something that you might actually talk about in detail, maybe in like a 500 level poli-sci class, maybe a 400, something along those lines, where you're really kind of like tussling with naming variables and trying to do research that way. So what's more important, while I can give you an answer, and the tiny URL there is the answer from Dr. McDonald out of University of Florida. He gives a definition of what the two is, and it has to be with being more precise in the results. It's more reactive. He likes the way the tests run. But another component to that that's kind of fun, and this is an opportunity for us to think about political science as a field of study, is that when you're doing research, like all of these things that we've talked about, yesterday we talked about rational choice, and those are all things that have been named and honed and defined by previous kind of gods in political science. And so when we're trying to define these concepts, we have to go back and we have to name our variables. We have to give a very tight definition to what those variables are. So what you're seeing here, that I think is a kind of a cool way to kind of step out of having to know the difference between VEEP and VAP, is that when, just like you would in a science class, you have to name those variables, you have to have a precise definition, and it helps with replicating those experiments over time. Because as you guys know, in the scientific method, the most important components or most important steps are peer review and replication. Did you know that? Of course you did. All right, so warm up. This is your homework from last night. So you guys had this, and I'm gonna roll through it really quickly. To remind you, I wanted you to take a look at identifying the age group that generally increased between 2012 and 16, describe a pattern in the data between race and Hispanic origin, and draw a conclusion. Yesterday was our skill. So if we go back, we're going to see here that the differences, or that the single biggest age group that grew in between 12 and 16 is you guys. Oh my God, woo! You guys should be so excited. That's you. You did it. Do it again. All right. So we see here, and that would be our answer, that the age group there is increasing between 12 and 16 was the 18 to 29-year-old age group. Make sure you get those definitions correct. So kind of like take a look up there. Make sure you don't say 18 to 24, which is what I had written down earlier. Ooh, I didn't look at my variables. And then increase, and then I'm flexing here, right? So I'm going beyond just naming. I'm actually showing some evidence. I'm defining, right, or describing by saying increasing 3% amongst white voters, 1.3 between races non-Hispanic, and 1.5 amongst Hispanics. So now we're looking for a pattern. I'm going to go back, pattern between race and Hispanic origin, and there it is. We should see that the pattern is that they all decrease between 2012 and 2016. We probably could come up with some really great reasons why. Maybe we will. All right, so our pattern here is that between 12 and 16, we had a decrease. And again, we want to show that we can interact with the data. We are doing the heavy lifting. We're not making the reader presume anything about our ability to interface with data. So make sure that you do that. The decrease ranged negative 0.6% for 45-year-olds, 45 to 64-year-olds, and so on and so forth. You can read that, right? So just get that data interfacing going. Do some simple math. Don't do regression analysis. No one's asking you to do that. No one's asking you to do chi-square, any of that stuff. Just adding, subtracting. Now, I did want to point out to you, because this is a question that frequently comes up in my own class. Well, why are the Census Bureau demographics reported so strangely? And so I just want to take a time out here to make sure that we're all on the same page. I want you to remember that ethnicity is a cultural characteristic that defines a person. Race is a social construct, meaning it's fabricated by humans. That's rooted in physical characteristics used to define a person. They're not the same thing. So the U.S. Census Bureau is going to collect information about race and ethnicity separately at present, and they change all the time. Anytime there's a census coming up, there's a big discussion about what kinds of information are we going to collect, what are we going to name the different demographic groups. We want to make sure that, especially today, we maybe spend a little bit more time thinking about what those different subgroupings would like to be referred to as, if they want to be compressed with other groups, so on and so forth. So why is this important? I mean, we should all be super thankful the U.S. Census Bureau does such an amazing job, because that is the backbone of all social research that's done. And it's also used to create all kinds of policy programming and funding levels for states, including funding for things like education and for roads and for healthcare and things like that. So we want to make sure that your parents do the census this year. It's super important, right? It's due in April. Okay. So connecting to previous knowledge, how does ideology relate to party affiliation? Oh my gosh, I don't think I answered C. Did I? No, I didn't. Oh well, you know what? It's a freebie for today. Look, I make mistakes. Who's going to catch me? All right, catch me if you can. So our parties are large are collections of voting coalitions who band together for one major purpose, and that is just to win. To win? That seems so weird. Why? That's it? How does that relate to political ideology? Well, you know what? Let's get there. Okay, let's stop before we start going down this rabbit hole with parties. So the first thing I want you guys to remember is that when we talk about American political culture, there's 5 different components that we are generally universally referring to. That's individualism, equality of opportunity, free enterprise, rule of law, and limited government. Believe it or not, we all kind of agree that those are important, and we find them threaded throughout the Constitution and other founding documents that you've studied in this class, and then you studied in U.S. history too. So what that really means is we are actually members of a consensual political culture, as opposed to conflictual, which we were not like debating whether or not people have basic rights. That's kind of what we're getting at with conflictual political culture. Instead, we all agree that these are important, and we can find those important things kind of embedded in those documents. So for instance, when we talk about individualism, we're talking about an enlightenment ideal, that should be capitalized, an enlightenment ideal that values the fundamental worth of the individual. Where might we find kind of the imprints, the fingerprints of individualism? We see it in the Declaration, we see it in the Bill of Rights. The next one, equality of opportunity. Humanity is created to pursue natural rights. You've heard that too. And that should also be capitalized, I think. Don't hold me to that. Connects back to the Declaration. We talk about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all of those things, direct connection. And also the 14th Amendment. It's the Equal Protection Clause is very much so reflective of this ideal of equality of opportunity. Free enterprise, belief that government should facilitate economic success, is going to connect back to things like Congress's enumerated or numbered. Numbered is an inherently limiting function, which means that it has a beginning and an end, right? So those enumerated economic powers are going to be found in Article 1, Section 8. Things like establishing currency, regulating trade, that's interstate, taxation on foreign products, setting weights and measures, and copyrights and patents. Those are all things that are there to facilitate commerce. The next one, rule of law, a principle that the government establishes laws that apply equally to all citizens, that no one lives outside of that. We're not Thomas Hobbes here, right? We're not the Leviathan, so everyone is prescribed to the same set of boundaries on our abilities to do things. And so that's going to connect back to checks and balances, as well as transparency that's facilitated through law and the free press. And finally, our limited government is the belief that our government can only exercise powers delegated to it by the people. And that connects back to separation of powers, federalism, Bill of Rights, and bars on governmental powers found in Article 1, Section 9, and Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, 9 being federal limits and 10 being states. So, okay, so like we understand what these ideologies are. How do we understand that in the context of these values in the context of our ideologies? And so the answer is relatively kind of apparent here. It's not that we disagree that they're important. We disagree in terms of which one is the most important. And I'm not saying that the list here that I've given you in the order that it's in is the only acceptable answer. I'm saying that if you were to ask a conservative how they might rank these 5 items once they knew what they meant, they probably might put free enterprise up there on top, or they might put individualism up top, right? But they definitely think that those two things they're probably more likely to put those things at the top. Whereas if you were to talk to a liberal, they might say, well, I think equality of opportunity is most important, the penultimate power, or the penultimate value. Rule of law might be number 2. And of course, if you're a libertarian, you might get them to say that individualism is first, and then limited government, so on and so forth. So their rankings, their individual opinions are subject to change, but if we take a look at how most people answer these questions with their political ideology, they kind of somehow flush out like this. So hopefully you took the political compass test, and I'm always get the feedback that the questions are very interesting. They're very polarizing, and that's a limitation that measurement instrument has, is that they don't give you a ton of options, and so they're really kind of making you fall between these binary values, and they're very dramatic. Of course they are. So, but you kind of should see that they tend to come across, most Americans tend to fall somewhere in this circled region here. And so that, number 1, is really where we would find our political spectrum, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But number 2, where you precisely come in on that value system there is subject to change, right? We are constantly being socialized politically. We call it political socialization. Every single step that you take, every single event that happens is having an impact on how you feel about the interaction that you should have with the government, whether it be economically or your health or with anything else, with rights. So all of these events, whether they be major political events, whether they be generational or life cycle events, they're all changing the way that we understand that relationship between sovereign and governed. And so with that in mind, if most people fall in somewhere along this section here, right? And there's more information. If you want to go to that tiny URL, it has a really interesting evaluation done by the folks at Political Compass on all of the candidates who were running for office in 2020. Another great question that comes out that kids ask is, so are all liberals Democrats and are all conservatives Republican? Right? Which really makes us feel, again, like we have these binary choices, that you can only be a liberal Democrat and you can only be a conservative Republican. And if you're in the middle, you're nothing. And the answer to that is no, they're not binary. As a matter of fact, they're constantly shifting, number 1, whether or not you have liberal with Democrat or liberal with conservative. Those things are constantly aligning themselves as parties are responding to changes, which we'll talk a little bit about next class. But ideology speaks back to ideas that back our policy preferences, and identification speaks to who you choose to associate with to attempt to win office. So be careful. This is like a big brain moment. Remember, that's a pro tip, that you want to make sure that when you're talking, I usually like to, particularly in today's day and age, lump liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans together, because sometimes the question that might be before you might not be talking about both of the same things, and depending on which one you put down could truncate your ability to earn that point. Case in point, I believe that there is an example of that in tonight's homework. But so anyways, we'll talk more about that later. But be careful with the prompts when you're working with ideology and party identification. Like I said, I would try to get into the habit of comboing those things together. So what do we need to know about this? We're pooling resources, right? Parties are here to help us pool together our ideological preferences so that we can be able to influence policy outputs. And there are other things that help us do that too. It's not just parties. Parties are amongst the oldest, although not the oldest. I would say, we'd probably say media would be the oldest, since it was there at the time of the founding of our country. And then parties are going to grow out of very, very quickly, almost like instantaneously. But interest groups, they've been around a heck of a long time. Elections have been a long time. So all of these things are ways where we can pool our policy preferences together and convey those interests to our policymakers in Washington, D.C., or in state houses, or wherever they may be. right? This allows us to pressure government for beneficial policies, and that's why we call it a linkage. It's linking us back to the government, right? And so for more on this, I'm going to violate our social distancing rule for today. I brought a friend in who wants to read to you something that's really important. All right, here's my friend. Maybe you know him, maybe you don't. His name is James Madison. Hopefully you've heard of him. But he had something really important to say about how we can understand these things being linked together. So I'm going to let James Madison talk. The greater number of citizens, an extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government. And it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. Extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Wow, that was a lot, James. I mean, thank you. What did you just say? All right, here's the most important part. This is one of the more famous quotes that comes out of this, and what he's really talking about, this is a component in Federalist 10 that might help us understand a little bit more about this idea of pluralism. That we have to, he kind of envisions us being able to influence the government by making it possible for everyone to have an equal playing field when it comes to having conversations with the government. And he assumes that we're not going to be doing this as individuals. He assumes for the most part that this is going to be done through some kinds of organizations. He calls them factions. He also calls them at times parties, right? But some ways for us to condense our ideas with other people, and therefore we can speak in unison and therefore speak louder to convey our interests. He says that if you're in a very small, organized direct democracy, that it's very easy for the majority to kind of run ramshod over all of the minority and to do significant harm. But he says that if we dilute those things over time, it becomes very much so. It becomes very difficult for the majority to be tyrannical, and therefore it's going to decrease the likelihood that that tyranny will reign. And that really is a huge concern of the Federalist Papers. We're going to talk more about that later, and if I went too fast there, I will hit it up for you in about a week and a half. Okay, so how does this connect back to parties? Well, again, we have parties, but I want to make sure that you understand that they are not these like all-powerful organizations that are, the same from the very tippy top, from the president all the way down to the bottom. That there's some variety to it. Let's get into how that happens right now. So not all liberals, we know this, not all liberals are Democrats, and not all conservatives are Republicans. This has fluctuated over time. We have a fancy term for that called party realignment. What's up, Vioki? Party realignment gets to this idea that the kind of coalitions that are found under this big tent party brand name are going to shift, and they might walk in and out. And that process has happened all throughout American history, although we haven't had a party realignment, at least not in Vioki's definition, in quite some time. More on that maybe later. I'll maybe share some stuff with you that way if you're curious to know more. But what do we see in these big tents, right? We see that when they all get together, right, when all of these groups, when all of these communities come together and they have their ideas and they have their opinions, their whole purpose is to win, right? This is a direct connection to win. So they are going to create a list of policy ideas. Together, we call them platforms. Each one individually is called a plank. So if we go to the Democratic platform, they're going to talk about environment and healthcare and this and that, and so will the Republicans. But if we pull out and we look at, we're just comparing, the platform for healthcare between Dems and Republicans, we're comparing planks. Party committees in the government and in the electorate are going to organize these efforts. They're going to help facilitate this effort, which is going to require them to have a really funky structure, which we'll talk about in a second. Their efforts are going to be focused on mobilizing and educating voters on party candidates and on policies. We're going to be recruiting volunteers, super important, and so are donors to support party activities because it takes a lot of money to get people elected. And then finally, they're going to recruit candidates who appeal to party voters. So let's break this down a little bit. I want to kind of show you the pantheon of liberals and conservatives right now who are aligning themselves under the brand big tent known as Republican and Democrat. And, this is like constantly in flux. So I may have left somebody out here. It's not intentional. I just am doing this for illustrative purposes. But Republicans, roughly, we're talking about the religious right. We're talking about the establishment. We're talking about Tea Party. We're talking about moderates, and we're talking about libertarians. And they all kind of crowd into that big tent. They're going to compete amongst themselves for clout so that they can go ahead and kind of push their will away around, to get what they want, and maybe to control the messaging coming out of the party so that they can cooperate and appease their voters. The same thing happens within the Democrats right now. We have, these are the worst nicknames ever, but hey, whatever. What am I going to do? We have the super progressives, like associating with AOC and a bunch of folks who associate with her. And we have the very progressive with Elizabeth Warren, the new guard with Booker, the old guard, Biden is a good example. And we have moderates, and then we have conservative Democrats, and sometimes they're called blue dog, but that's really getting to people who believe in being socially liberal and fiscally conservative. So if those are our two big tents, right? Crowded into that tent, besides kind of like factions that you might be rolling with or communities that you might prescribe to, we can also slice and dice this tent up in a different way too. We might want to talk about the party and the electorate. And the party and the electorate has concrete, discrete tasks that they're doing to help facilitate winning office. Things like straight ticket voting, we talked about that yesterday. Voting in primaries and general elections, helping to activate the base with messaging, volunteering, donating money to candidates, self-identifying, just saying, hey, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. The very act of that is going to help the party and the electorate. Articulating policies to public and then selecting candidates via the nomination process. Versus party organization, these are going to be people who maybe are a little bit more professional, but not necessarily holding office. So they're going to select and support candidates via the nomination process. They're going to help grow a bench of future candidates. They're going to articulate our platforms, give cues to voters with endorsements and ads. They have a decentralized network to facilitate winning office at every level, from national to local. They'll coordinate funding and volunteering. And at the national level, the National Committee is going to coordinate funding, messaging, cooperation between national, state, and local committees. You even have committees back in Congress that help get people in the House and Senate get reelected for each party. And then the final thing here is the facilitation of policy coordination between policymakers at various levels, kind of like a pipeline. And then the final thing is party and the government. And they are there to coordinate writing and passage of policy that's espoused by party supporters, as well as enforce it. That should be on there too. They're going to coordinate messaging amongst their caucus. Caucuses are unofficial groups that get together and talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about. Hopefully you watched the Iowa caucus this past year. Maybe you even did a caucus in class. They are fun and different than voting. They will run individual campaigns and endorse or fund others, call those leadership PACs. They will craft platform that meets the needs of the party organization and party and the electorate, particularly on down ballot races. Remember, those are the ones that are under the headliners, and identify factions within the party that the office holder wishes to court. And the final thing, and we talked about this yesterday, so this is a review, they're going to write policy that's beneficial to the party's entrenchment. So we're talking about election law. Once we understand that, we can see how this is going to affect the realities of winning office across the country. So the pie, the pig, and the po, they are going to be flexing in and out, starting at the most local level, which is in the precinct, which is where you would go to vote. They're going to flex in and out so that they can assist whatever that person is who's running for whatever particular office you're talking about. And it's kind of like Legos, right? Like you have that one individual Lego. Today it might be that individual Lego might be a part of a teeny tiny little shed, but tomorrow it might be the part of a gigantic mansion, right? And so the more kind of precincts that we're building into this, the more the kind of contours of that election are going to change. The platform might change, who the candidate might change, and that also is going to change from race to race and from year to year. But beyond that, despite the fact that we have, and there's like one really great word for all of this, which is decentralized, right? It is possible that The party committees at the local level may disagree with something that's happening at the national level because of concerns that they have. I know that locally, a fantastic example of that, the 2016 election, there was a candidate, Barbara Comstock, who's running for office, and she was in a Virginia District 11, which was a conservative district. And she made the decision in her campaign to distance herself from the president, the now president, because she was concerned that some of his messaging wouldn't resonate well with the voters in Virginia 11, which is an electoral district right outside of Washington, D.C. So that's kind of an example of where, sometimes individuals who are running for office have to make decisions to kind of get online with whatever that platform is, or to break with that platform because of concerns that they have about making their constituents happy. And that is super important. Making your constituents happy is like job number one, right? And of course, if you're at the top of that ballot, you still have down ballot concerns. Lesser known candidates will do something called riding the coattails, which means that if you are a straight ticket voter and you didn't pay attention to the soil and water conservation, you may end up leaving. Now, I'm a little nervous because my internet connection is unstable. I don't know what that means, but if I go away, I don't know, survive, could be fine. Okay, so let's look for some evidence of decentralization here. This is one of my favorite old school FRQ prompts from College Board. I really love this one. Let's play around with it a little bit. So I'm going to do a little thinking technique called See, Think, Wonder. And so we're going to go through this, and I'm just going to kind of show you how we would roll through this. This is a great practice for trends versus patterns. So the first step I'm going to see here is that there's distinct difference between trends and patterns that I need to associate with the number of offices involved, right? So if I'm looking down here at the bottom at the solid black bar, I notice that we're talking about electoral votes for Democratic presidential candidate. Remember how we talked about you have to really make sure you understand? Look at that y-axis. We're talking about percent demographic. Across the bottom, we've got a time span. So we're looking at a time series thing here running from 1940 to it stops around 2020 or 2000, I'm sorry. Right, and so we have two different measures here. One of them is seats held by Democrats in the House in the South, and then the solid black line is percent of Southern state electoral votes. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my trend, because I see more of a trend up here with the dotted black line that's looking at U.S. House held by the Dems. I see that the Dems seats in the House are generally trending down, but they're not as sharply as seen in presidential votes. So I kind of, right, I'm seeing a negative association or negative correlation here. So something is happening over time. It's not significant, right? We're starting up around 90% and we're ending around 40%. And that's over a 60-year span. So it's a very slow trickle. In between there, we've had 30 elections for the House because they're 2-year terms. So I think that there's a downward trend. At times, Democrats are able to continue satisfactorily representing their constituents despite a rejection of presidential candidate. Because I kind of see that there's something going on with that solid black line. So whatever, there's definitely a different environment happening between the two offices. So looking at the red bar, the solid black line I'm pointing out to you in red, I see that there's more of a pattern here, right? I'm looking and I think that I've noticed if I break this down, I got to think about who was in office at what time. I've got some Southern candidates, some Democratic candidates. LBJ was from Texas. Carter was from Georgia. Clinton was from Arkansas, right? I don't know where Hubert Humphrey and Carter were from, but Kennedy was from Massachusetts. What I have noticed is even if I don't know where Humphrey and Carter are from, which is fine, whatever, it's cool, right? Just go with it. But these guys, LBJ, Carter, and Clinton, those are a little bit better, easier for me to recognize, and I know they're from the South. So what I notice here is that they have a much better time with their presidential electoral votes when you are putting up a Southern Democrat. But it seems logical, right? All right. So I wonder, right, if I've done my thinking and my seeing, I wonder if there's a concept out there that might help us understand what is happening. And guess what? There is. Oh my God, of course there is. Of course there is. Here it is. It's our incumbent and re-election rates. Holy cow. I want to run for House because if I run for the House, I will never be defeated. That's what this tells me. Do you see it? Never going to lose my job. I could sleep on my desk and I won't lose my job. Just kidding. I'm totally throwing them under the bus right now. Our re-election rates, an incumbent is somebody who is running for re-election. And we see here that there is a very distinct pattern going back all the way from 1948 to 1996. And I'll give you a hint, it continues on to today. That the more the more brand recognition you have, if you're running for re-election, you are way more likely to maintain that position than you are to lose it, right? So we're seeing some really amazing trends here that people in the House are kind of consistently holding between 92% and maybe 85%. In the Senate, kind of depends, right? There's some other things that are going on here. We could get into some patterns that have to do with presidential elections and all this other stuff. But we see that those elections for the Senate, which we have a third of the Senate up for re-election every even-numbered year, they are less consistent, but they still have a really high likelihood of being re-elected. So incumbents do better in re-elections than efforts by challengers, and that shifting factions or coalitions can have a delayed effect on the incumbent office holders. So if we go back to that, well, that's what we're getting at here, right? That this line has to do with the fact that they are able to overcome the slings and arrows, the outrageous slings and arrows of presidential elections because they have held office already and they have clout, they have name brand recognition. People are like, yeah, I'm satisfied with that person. So let's try this with an FRQ. Our first one is we're just gonna look at D, right? We've already done this A and B, I lied to you, we didn't do C. Oops, I'm sorry. All right, so we're explaining action the Democratic Party can take to increase the odds of winning Southern states. So our D point here is we have to take what we've seen in our data, what we've assumed to be true based on the data, our drawing of conclusions, and now we have to pull in some new content and connect it, right? And it's kind of like, can you think on your feet? Can you make this make sense as it relates to other components? Because everything in politics is interconnected in some way. So we want to connect this discrete topic to something else. It sometimes can be in another unit altogether. Tonight's homework will be, all right, but we also need to connect it so that our inferences are still logical, right? We're still grounded in that data. So our answer here is the Democratic Party could increase their odds of winning the Southern states by nominating a moderate Southern Democrat as a Democratic presidential candidate. Here's where I'm grounding it back to that data chart. According to the chart, candidates who were more moderate and from the South, like Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, received more votes than candidates like Herbert Humphrey, and George McGovern. And George McGovern was very liberal. I mean, like, he was very, very liberal. And so more Southerners, like, this is kind of our assumption here, is that more Southerners tend to be conservative than they do liberal. And so if the Democrats are running a more conservative candidate, they may fare better. Boom. Boom, boom, boom. All right, let's do our check for understanding. This is a data chart. There's a lot going on here. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to take a look at this. As you're looking at it, I'm going to read it to you nice and slow. The data in the table provide clear evidence that A, Republicans were increasingly likely to defect from their party's candidate. Okay, got to look at the Republican Party. How did they do? All right. B, the vote in the Midwest predicted the outcome rather consistently. So I got to look at regional stuff. Okay, cool. C, the East has become a Republican stronghold. Okay, regional stuff. D, voters under the age of 30 were more likely than older voters to support the Democratic candidate. Now, I'm going to help you out. A, we don't, there's nothing in here that really, well, you go to political affiliation for that, right? So you've got to go and you've got to find, A, you'd have to go to political affiliation. B and C, we're talking regional. D, we're getting into age. So make sure that you're like going back and kind of knocking those out. And I want to see if you got the answer and I kind of have to rush us a little bit because I don't want to run over. Did you get it? It's B. Yeah, of course you got it. You're brilliant. All right, look at this one. All right, which of the following best explains how political parties are likely to respond to the data in the chart? So we're looking at population by race and ethnicity. We're looking at white alone, non-Hispanic white alone, Hispanic, Black, Asian alone, 2 or more races. We now know why these are broken down so weirdly, like not weirdly, but just we're not comfortable with it, right? Again, this has to go back to Census Bureau data and how they report stuff. Okay, across the bottom, we have total percentage of population. We've got some definitions of what some of these terms are. We've got 2012 is solid Black, 26 is projected. Important to know, we're not living in 2060 right now. All right, so what are the best, which of the following best explains how parties are responding to data in the chart? A, political parties are likely to continue to stand by their traditional positions and not bother to appeal to groups that have not previously been included in their base. So this might have to rely on some of our previous discussions, like yesterday's in particular. B, political parties will adapt their positions and find ways to appeal from growing demographic groups. C, political parties will adapt by switching from candidate-centered campaigns to campaigns that strategically mobilize voters with a consistent message, right? We haven't really talked about candidate-centered yet, but we will. So I'll give you a hint, it's not C. All right. D, parties advocate for proportional representation systems so that groups with larger populations are able to win seats and be represented more fairly. But proportional, we may not know what that is, but we could probably deduce that proportional means like how well you do in an election means that's how many votes you get. That seems to be a logical thing, and that is what it is. So if we're taking a look at these questions, right, what are we going to use? The critically important component here is that you have to use the data in the chart, right? That we're using the information that is provided to us. Don't make inferences for things that are outside of the chart. That is one of the major reasons where kids and their responses kind of go off the deep end because they've made a couple of inferences about how they might, or that's beyond the data that's there. So for that reason, political parties are likely to stand by their traditional and not appeal to groups that have not been included in their base. I mean, that's a good answer maybe, but maybe not. I mean, there might be some issues with that because I still see that if most white tend to vote Republican, that by 2060 it's projected that 69% will be that whites will be 69% of the population. No, that's not right. That's not how that's adding up. Well, we'd have to sit longer with this one, right? Wouldn't we? Okay. The answer here, as I'm very quickly sidestepping away from A because I'm misreading this one. So is B, that parties are going to adapt their positions and find ways to appeal to voters. And what I'm going to do is, because I'm looking at this and I'm like, I can't even add these things up. That makes no sense. That's not 100%. How about I come back and talk about this one on Monday so that I can get my ducks in a row? What this goes to show you guys, and it's an important lesson to be learned, is that sometimes when we're doing questions really quick, even teachers get it wrong. Sometimes we have to sit and think about these things. And when I pulled this down the other day, I was like, I get it. And now I'm like, I don't get it. Okay, so we're looking at 5.3. You were looking at analyzing election data to explain how parties are organized to facilitate communication of policy preference to makers. I can successfully do this when you get a quantitative FRQ under your belt. Hopefully you're feeling like you're empowered to do that. And here is your homework for tonight. It is embedded in the slideshow that is in the description down on the bottom. Make sure that you guys get a look at that and have some fun with it. This is a really fun FRQ. We'll talk more about it next class. And remember that if you are having device and internet access problems, we know that not all students have access to the internet or to a device, and so we're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, you can reach us directly to let us know at cb.org/tech. And thank you for watching as always. I wish you guys a very great weekend. go out, but please remember to, engage in social distancing. And I wish you the very best. And we'll see you back here on Monday. Bye.